Welcome to tonight's functional forum. We're excited to have you here tonight. We're going to talk with you about neurotherapy and we're going to put a little twist on it. We typically talk about it in regards to individuals, and tonight we are going to spend some time with you talking about the brain's relationship to how we are in relationships. And then we're going to talk about creating better bonds through use of neurotherapy. So we thought we'd start out tonight just talking a little bit about relationships and the history of how we have tended to think about relationship struggles, conflict in relationships. And because I have a background in therapy, I just thought it would be interesting to kind of take a look at how we have kind of inside the therapy room, how we have conceptualized relationship conflict issues, and then how we've gone about trying to help either couples or people in other relationships be able to develop better conflict resolution. So for a very long time in the field of therapy, the idea of working with couples, working with people who had conflict issues, had a lot to do with teaching conflict resolution skills. And so it literally would look like two people coming in to see a therapist and talking about, kind of where they're butting heads, and then the therapist teaching things like active listening skills and those types of skills for interaction. And then, the two people would practice in the therapy session. They'd get really good at it. They'd be given homework to go do that the next time that a conflict came up. And repeatedly over time, I remember this when I started doing therapy, this was kind of the way to do it. And it very quickly dawned on me that it didn't work. And so I would talk with other therapists about it and consult about it. And it dawned on me even more that it just doesn't work. It wasn't just that it wasn't working in my therapy practice. And so in the probably about the mid 90s, there were a couple of researchers, John and Julie Gottman, who started looking at this question of why is it not working? Because what would happen is these people would go out after they had practiced their skills, they would come back to their next session, you'd say, how'd things go? And they would look at you like you were nuts and say, that was a complete bust. Like, we got into an argument. I lost my cool. He lost his cool. Nothing good happened from it. And, we try and talk about why is that, what happened? You had all these skills and they just couldn't figure it out. So fast forward a little bit. And in the mid 90s, John and Julie Gottman opened up a research center and started addressing this question of like, why does it not work to teach conflict skills? And really what they came to in their research is they would bring couples they had an apartment, they still have an apartment out in Seattle, and they would bring couples in for a weekend and they would wire them up so that they were starting to look at some of what was going on in their brain. And they would actually have them engage in conflict, like areas that were known conflicts for them. And what they started to find out was that when they started to experience the conflict, their limbic system, the amygdala, just lit up, and the frontal lobe disengaged. And what we know about that is if you don't have a frontal lobe engagement, there's no way you're going to be able to actually apply any of the conflict skills that you may have learned, right? Because you are just now in fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so this was like, it sounds kind of like a no-brainer at this point in time, but during the mid 90s when this came out, this was revolutionary in the field of couples therapy because we now felt like, oh my God, we have something to do. Before they can do those conflict skills, we're going to have to teach them how to do this physiological self-soothing process, right? To be able to kind of calm down the sympathetic system, get the parasympathetic system back online a little bit better. And so we all got excited and we started teaching that. And sometimes it worked. And many times it didn't work. And so the head scratching continued. And so then we fast forward to where we are now. And what we've realized is that, oh, yeah, we forgot about changing the brain. We kind of talked about how the brain was being activated when conflict happened, and we were addressing it from a body standpoint, which was a bonus because that was better than just the cognitive piece we used to do. But we still were forgetting this idea of how the brain plays a role, and how important it is to have a well-regulated brain in order for you to do the physiological calming that you need to do so that you can do or engage in those conflict resolution skills. And so this is, for me, this is a really exciting place to be, in terms of the things that it brings in regards to helping with conflict resolution. It's like kind of a game changer because we now have opportunity to use neurotherapies to help people regulate brains so that they can then do all those other really cool things that we as therapists have been trying to teach them to do, with limited success up until this point in time. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Guy. For me, it's just been a really, like it has, I've been in the field for about 30 years, 30 plus years, and to be able to be at this place now where I feel like there's something we can do to really help somebody who just literally does not have the capacity to self-soothe because their brain is dysregulated. And so for me, it gets really exciting, and I feel really hopeful about kind of the future of like not only couples therapy, but conflict resolution and that sort of thing. But I'd be curious to hear comments that you might have.
Yeah, so I think like you've got a good frame for it because your um clinical experience, in particular doing couples therapy, puts you in a place where you get to see this acted out over and over and over again across many iterations, many different couples, many different dynamics. I want to maybe expand the field a little bit, just for our
Yep,
listeners to not be thinking about this only in the sense of in a treatment room, but really in every interaction. So this could be the person who is ringing up your order at a
yep,
store. It could be you in a line with a bank teller, standing behind a stranger. It could be you with a work colleague. There's any
yep,
number of places, right? It's like any place where we have relationship. And in
yep,
a certain way, it's even true within ourselves because we all have, kind of selves and internal dialogues. But it's easier to model if we have two brains in the works instead of one brain. But just to expand the frame to really any time we're in relationship. Um, and
yep,
then another thing that kind of, came to mind as you were sharing was this idea of it kind of being a spectrum, right? Because you said it really well. You talked about the amygdala hijack and that happens, and kind of we get frontal lobe disengagement and all of that, and that's true, and that does happen. But there's the spectrum of it, which is just having like less than the optimal balance of kind of emotional side or amygdala hippocampal activity. So even too much of that will just constrain access to the executive network. And and that means that maybe our internal thought processes and our what we're taking in, what we're making of what we're hearing, we're formulating a response, and then we're going to deliver our response to what we've heard, that all of that can just be degraded a little bit. And and so it's not an offline, again, it's a gradation, right? And
yep,
so all of us in any moment can have this happen where our access to our higher functions gets minimized, and then whatever our either interpretation of the world or our action into the world is less than optimal. And so just to say it, like to take it out of that sense of an extreme and
yep,
just say even little gradations of self-regulation can equal better, that process of listening and considering and responding gets better, and
Yep.
we get a better outcome, right? And to me, like that's the kind of that's the interesting part of it, the nuance side of it, as opposed to more like the extreme
Yeah.
side of it, which, but also again, you see a lot of that. So it's not
Sure.
all
Except that,
part of the,
yeah.
yeah.
Part of what you're saying reminds me of something when Gottmans were doing their research, they came up with the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And that has become just like if you go to any communications department in a college, they're teaching that now as conflict, part of their conflict resolution courses. But one of the pieces in there is one of the four horsemen is contempt. And what I found really interesting when I was reading Gottman's research in the beginning was that they showed that one of the number one signals of contempt, like a person feeling contempt toward another, is an eye roll, and not like the big eye roll that we think of, but a subtle eye roll. And it's that sort of thing when I think about you kind of talking about any little degradation. There are like sometimes it's the great blow up that we see, or the person who just absolutely freezes and then shuts down, and isn't able to do much of anything. But it's those other small behaviors too that can have such a significant impact and I see this. You were talking about you were mentioning the grocery store line, and I would just invite everybody to pay attention when you're at the grocery store and watch the people that are standing in line and how they, if it's a longer line and they're having to wait or somebody's got in front of them and is taking a little bit longer than they want. I cannot tell you the number of times that I have seen eye rolls happen. And that's just like one of those small things, right? The person's behind that's doing the eye roll isn't yelling at anybody, isn't doing anything other than clearly feeling some level of conflict and contemptuousness. And so I think there's a lot of fascinating information to be had in kind of this whole idea of how, like I like your idea of like the spectrum of like degradation of the brain and subsequent behaviors that happen.
Yep. And another thing that had came to mind as you were talking was, um, so the idea of kind of micro skills, and
Mm,
over our presentations, we've used kind of the analogy of tennis. So I thought maybe a different analogy, but really just thinking about like my own experience. And I remember when I was training, um, whenever I would train with somebody who was significantly better, I often had this sense of like, man, they're so much faster than I am.
mm,
And one of the guys that I trained with, I would talk to him about it. It's like, how are you so fast? Like, I just don't understand it. And he's like, I'm not fast. I'm no faster than you. It's just like I'm working on timing, and I know where you're going to be 3 seconds ahead. So I just know to be there and not where you are. So it's timing. It's not that I'm fast. And then I thought about that, and I thought all of the time that I have spent trying to get faster, right? Like training skills, foot speed skills, speed skills, you just all of these skills to get faster. And and what I needed to be doing was working on my timing.
mhm.
And so we were talking about the skills, like the CBT type skills, where you
Yep.
teach people these skills, but they can't execute them
Yeah.
be, because there's a fundamental quality that needs to be there before that skill can be executed. And in many ways, the brain function is that piece. We need certain brain regions talking to each other so that that skill that they're being taught can actually happen, right? And so that, that's what was coming to my mind was all of the work I was doing in one area that just was never going to help. and
Yeah.
ultimately didn't help.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
and that how we do that with people, because we're thinking it looks like the skill needs to be in one place.
Yep.
We train the skill. They aren't able to deploy it, so we just think, well, we just have to train it harder.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
what we've learned, both of us coming from a kind of a clinical background with client time one
Yep.
on one, coming then to the brain and seeing that if the brain isn't doing what it needs to do, then behavior can't manifest, no matter how much you train the skill. Yeah.
Mhm.
So anyway, so just some things that came to my mind as you were sharing. Um, but it looks like you're going to go on and talk a little bit about what the brain is up to.
Sure. Yeah. So, I was having an interesting conversation this afternoon with a client, and talking about like the beautiful tapestry that is the web work of the brain, right? And how like we were kind of having a moment of sort of jointly fantasizing a trip through that web work. And it kind of reminds me of what we're talking about here with the brain, in terms of its role in regards to conflict, like how we experience conflict and then what we do or how we respond or react to conflict, depending on which of those we are doing. And it's this interesting mix, and we have a little bit of it up on this screen, but it's much more complex than what is written up here on the screen. But there are a lot of different areas of the brain, different structures that play a role in how we first of all, how we experience conflict, and then what we do with it. We talked about the amygdala. It is, in our limbic system. It is really like our threat detector. One of the things that the amygdala is super, super good at is detecting threats. So, like the kind of threat, like I don't know if the door opened up in my office right now and there was a big stranger standing there, I would likely experience a sense of threat for a moment anyway. And that's a kind of higher level of threat. But I might experience that same threat if I don't know, if I, came out of the bedroom in the morning and my partner looked at me and said, "Oh, is that what you're wearing today?" That kind of a thing. And one is clearly actually more potentially a threat than another, but the amygdala does not do a good job of differentiating threat levels. It's very good at detecting perceived threat, not good at differentiating the level. And so it just sends out the message that we're in threat. And then that's what kind of creates that like the frontal lobe disengagement, right? Is that it shuts that down so that we can just do what we need to kind of be safe. And so most often in conflict in relationships, we don't need our prefrontal lobe to shut down so that we can just get safe. We actually need the opposite there, because that prefrontal cortex is the part that really has to do with our making about our behaviors. It plays a significant role in impulse control. Our anterior cingulate is a part of the prefrontal cortex, and that has a lot to do with detecting conflict, and then sending signal for emotional control, that sort of thing. And so if those areas are dysregulated, all of those processes can be compromised, and to varying degrees. To your point, Guy, that can kind of run on a spectrum. And then, we have in the back part of our brain, we've got the posterior cingulate, which it helps to regulate where we place attention, which if you think about that in conflict, oftentimes what takes us from like being irritated by somebody to some bigger form of sense of frustration or anger is that we perseverate on the irritation, right? We just keep our attention there a little bit too long. So the posterior cingulate can play a role in that and in evaluating the emotion that is coming up and that sort of thing, and then processing personal aspects of situations. And so that anterior and cingulate and posterior cingulate are kind of should be playing nice together, having conversation with one another very smoothly, so that as the emotion comes up, the anterior cingulate can say, okay, here's what we're going to do with this emotion, and be able to moderate it or mediate it in a certain way. And then again, if those areas are dysregulated in some way, or they compromise all of those um, tasks that those areas of the brain have to work with. Default mode, it can play a significant role in that too. Actually, the image up on the screen there shows you kind of all the different areas of the brain that are a part of the default mode network. Default mode network, one of its primary roles has to do with self-reflection, but also plays a big role with theory of mind. So that's like, being able to like understand if you and I are having a conversation, Guy, for me to be able to understand kind of where you're coming from. And then it also plays a significant role with empathy, as does the mirror neuron network. And empathy is crucial in conflict resolution, being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. If you can't do that, there's going to be like miscommunication that's going to happen clearly. And and then default mode plays a significant role in perspective taking too. So you can just take a look at that one network and see how, if that network isn't functioning well, conflict, whether it's with a partner, whether it's with a coworker, whether it's the person that's passing you by on the freeway, however that might be going, is not going to go well if this network is dysregulated. So any or all of these areas of the brain can have dysregulation that can play a role in first of all, how we experience the conflict, and then what we do with it. Anything you want to add, Guy?
Yeah, so a couple things. So when you talk about the amygdala, and you kind of talk about its role as threat detection. So just to add to that picture is when the amygdala, it has an ongoing dysregulation, that it may be sending a threat signal all the time. And so there doesn't need to be a trigger of the person walks into your treatment room. That's a big trigger versus the spouse says something that is, open to interpretation. In both of those examples, there was something to respond to, but then we can have an overactive amygdala that is we're just living in a state of threat.
Yep.
And then what we tend to do is then we'll tend to project that outside, try and find a reason for it in the world. And then things that aren't threatening get labeled as threatening. And if there's no corrective experience, then that just gets woven in to the system of these things are threats. And I know that because I've been living this way for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. And so I just know now my autobiographical memory is a memory that the world is threatening.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so all of so we can just, have that. And then, the anterior posterior cingulate is just it's just become a favorite little circuit of mine. And I would say, it's 100% that it's just because of it showing up more and more clinically, and that has just put me into relationship with it more and more. But this idea that this circuit of information from the body coming up into the brain, so kind of interoception, so information coming up into the brain, roughly registering here in the posterior cingulate, and again, we'll just say like these maps that we're laying out are very, very, very simplified because the brain doesn't do one of anything. like from this structure to this structure. That
Yep.
doesn't ever happen. It's always multiple overlapping networked function is actually what's happening. But to be able to talk about it in some way to make sense of it, we talk about it as if it's like wiring in your house where you flip this switch and that light turns on and there's a one-to-one correlation, right? Like the brains don't do that. But this idea of interoceptive information coming up into the posterior cingulate, and that generally kind of getting fleshed out as how do I feel? And then that information going to the anterior cingulate, where the frontal lobe, the executive network, gets brought in, and then it's kind of how do I think about how I feel? And then that information is sent back to the posterior cingulate, which layers on more information about all of those coded sensations that we called feelings, which then sends information down into the body to re-regulate the body. Right. So we have this constant, millisecond by millisecond system going from body to prefrontal cortex back down to body again. And when that circuit, gets disrupted, then stuff that's in the body, like dysregulation in the body, that could be temperature dysregulation, or it could be digestive dysregulation, could be blood sugar dysregulation, but dysregulation in the body that is coming up through those interoceptive circuits can get interpreted into feelings that we don't know enough to say, oh, that's just I ate something and my small intestine is irritated in this particular way, and that's all it is. Although that's possible to know, but again, when we have dysregulation, it gets labeled as something else, goes to the front of the brain, executive function acts on it, and if that process isn't optimized, it's going to send back information that might be an arousal signal, like something is wrong. And then we get a downward regulation of the gut that wasn't necessary, which causes more dysregulation, which sends up another signal of there's a problem. And then that cycle can just feed itself. And really the beginning of it could have been nothing more than having eaten something that didn't agree with you, right? But if in the midst of that cycle dysregulating the system, one enters into a relationship, into a conversation, and that conversation is a bit stressing, taxing, challenging, is calling on optimal function, as we talked about before, optimal function might not be there because that system has already been degraded slightly. That has nothing to do with that relationship. It has to do with what's happening, in the digestive system. So this circuit is it's a primary circuit to talk about in the idea of brain and relationship, but to understand and appreciate how much information is running through this circuit, that it isn't just relationship. It isn't just that other person. There's all kinds of other things that are, kind of clouding that system or creating dysregulation in that system that might actually spill over into the conversation with the person. And then default mode network. Yeah, I think it's this bringing in this network idea, I think is really important, right? Because we think about things like trauma and PTSD and how that changes the brain's ability to switch between networks. And that in a situation where in a regulated person, the default mode network would function in a particular way. In that person with PTSD, it doesn't do that.
Yeah.
And then we get a whole different cascade of how the brain is operating than what all of the models that we started talking about earlier would presume, right? And then again, when we say why can't people enact certain skills, it's like, well, because the map of the territory has been completely changed. The players who are supposed to be here aren't here. Yeah. Yeah. And so I think this understanding the network component in addition to the individual regions, but understanding this from a network
Yeah.
perspective, really is a helpful piece to bring in.
Yeah, this has been the whole idea of the network piece has been really like from a therapeutic standpoint has been significantly helpful for me in in working with couples because it provides me with some other perspective on how to help couples approach this. But even just having somebody who is you know, not able, like who shuts down when their system gets stressed out in some way. And it can be very small things that do it, but they literally shut down and cannot function. And to be able to talk with them about what's going on is really really helpful because one of the things that happens, and you know this, you've seen this with people, as you've worked with them, um, when they're in these places where, like, if shutdown happens in a relationship, somebody gets upset and and there's conflict and the person feels some sort of threat, whether it's conscious or not, that's what the is being perceived or contextualized in the brain, and they just shut down and they'll walk away and they won't talk or they'll that kind of thing. Along with that comes a lot of shame when they get out of that place and they're trying to figure out what went wrong. And so to be able to kind of bring in some of this information about, look, that this isn't necessarily from lack of trying, right? Or that there's something inherently wrong with you. This is a network in your brain, or this is your brain that is not functioning, not as you said, like some of the players are absent, right? And so we can't expect the team to show up in the way that we want them to. And it's been very like empowering to be able to use that. And I would say not only with couples, but just one-on-one, as people are talking about their lives and their interaction issues within their own lives and that sort of thing. So it's I really feel like I appreciate it more and more every day.
Mhm. Yeah, a couple of things there. So I think that piece about the shame and how we haven't learned how to separate out our brain function from our self function, like our
Yeah.
brain from our self. We talk a
Yep.
lot in neurotherapy of helping people distinguish between their brain and their mind. And I think that is a strong step in the direction of people beginning to parse between brain, mind, and self. And the value of that is it's in no way true or helpful when a person takes their brain has shifted gears into a less helpful gear, to take that as a failure of self and then to have
Yep.
shame about it, right?
Yep.
And so I do think bringing these understandings into the therapeutic relationship can help alleviate a lot of that,
Yeah.
if people can
Yep.
see, because we don't feel bad, we don't feel shame if I stub my toe and I have a bit of a limp for a while,
Yep.
right? It's just like I stubbed my toe. What do you
Yeah.
want, right? And so
Yep.
if somebody can just say, oh, I'm having an amygdala hijack moment, right? My brain is limping, I need a moment.
Yeah.
And then whether that's in it literally in the moment, or hey, you know what, I'm going to need to like maybe pause this relationship, this
Yep.
discussion,
Yep.
till I can kind of get like back on both feet, and then we can continue it. I had an example of this just the other day, in a business conversation. But it isn't just a business relationship. There's also, kind of a personal relationship, known the person for a long time. We get along. We both want to see that relationship continue into the future. We're mutually supportive, but there's some business stuff that we're trying to do as well that we think will be mutually beneficial. And and so we're kind of in this negotiation process, and they, came to the table with a change that wasn't a like I did not perceive as a positive change for me. And I noticed that, like, oh, that has triggered me, right? So I've got all kinds of things going. And, I was able to, in the moment, I also felt like this is somebody who can hear this and won't just like pack up their stuff and leave and be like, I can't do business with you, right? I mean, so it's context, but I was able to say, like, I'm not going to be able to have the conversation that we were planning today because this piece is really, I can already tell it set me off in a direction, and I'm just not going to be able to show up in a way that's going to lead to the outcome we both want. So, I've heard what you've had to offer. Great. I'm going to keep that in mind, but let's, reschedule for next week and we'll pick it up. And hopefully that will work out. We'll see. But again, I could just sense like my system is, I am not going to have the same conversation from that
Yeah.
point forward that I thought I was going to have coming in. And not that what was said was wrong or anything. It set me off. And
Hmm.
okay, so
Yep.
like again, the equivalent of like I just stubbed my toe,
Yeah.
and I can try and work through it, but that situation didn't need that, right? So I
Yeah.
could just say I'm
Yep.
going to need a couple of days,
Yeah. Well,
get
and I think,
reoriented and centered.
yeah, I think one of the keys too in what you were just sharing is like you recognized for you where you were at and what you needed, and but by saying I'm not going to be able to have this conversation, that oftentimes can then trigger the other person, right?
Mhm.
Because there's a fear of like, oh God, we're not going to get to have this conversation, or he's shutting me down, or whatever it might be, right? And so that piece that you said about, let's come back next week. That is like one of those like little relationship skills that you can utilize then to kind of help each other in that moment, right? To be able to recognize that, okay, what I'm going to say right now is probably has a potential to trigger this person, or create some concern there, and to be able to kind of do that piece can make a huge difference, because without that, um, more often than not, what happens is you might go away and settle yourself, and the other person has done the opposite, right? Unless they're, um, have worked enough and developed enough capacity to recognize, oops, I just got triggered, and kind of do the same thing. So, I'm appreciating that you added that component into it.
Yeah. And the other piece that was coming to mind as you were sharing was, um, I think with an understanding of the brain and individual regions, but also networks, and mostly I was thinking about networks, is for what I've found for myself when I am trying to do something that is a little bit more of a mind body skill or a little bit of a cognitive
Mhm.
behavioral, I can I can have a better sense of how does the network that I suspect is losing the plot here for the other person, what exercise, what practice, what strategy, what method brings that network back online versus it does the opposite, right?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
we might have somebody do a breathing exercise or a visualization exercise or any number of 1,000 kind of mind body
Yep.
skills. I did that for decades without an appreciation of the brain.
Mm.
And I was moderately successful with it, successful enough to keep it as a clinical practice and keep going. But now I can see it's like, oh, like all of this subset of skills, these are out because those regulate this network and this network and this network. But this person's problem is
Yeah.
arising, like say in their default mode network,
Yeah.
and 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 it's either become like overactivated or underactivated. And then do I want to pick a mind body skill that is going to, if it's overactivated, bring it down, and if it's underactivated, bring it back.
Mm.
And and so understanding the brain from that perspective allows me to eliminate a whole bunch of choices that are not going to be helpful and go with, I know these are the ones that affect this system in this way. And so the results that I get when I use those kind of, kind of, well, mind body skills, I was going to say kind of top down, but some of them are bottom up, right? They're
Yeah.
regulate the body to
Yep.
regulate the brain, and some of them are regulate the mind to regulate the brain. But it's learning to understand that there's a specificity in there. Like there always has been. Like that was always true of those techniques. I just didn't know,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And now I'm gaining an appreciation of, if I have somebody who I have a sense that their default mode network is kind of going offline, then what skills can I bring to the moment? What activity can I bring to the moment, invite them to do that will bring their default mode network back online and have them there for them, the resources there for them in the moment. So
Yeah. Yeah.
another
Yep.
way
Yeah.
that understanding the brain has helped with these other techniques, by no means a replacement for them.
Right. Yep. Okay, so Guy, I'm gonna just let you the next few slides, let you have some conversation about that
Sure.
to start it.
Yeah. So just to expand our network conversation, we were just talking about the default mode network in particular, but here we see, kind of 12 of the more common networks, and they're being ranked. So this is coming out of doing a QEEG neuroimaging, so an EEG based neuroimaging, looking at brain function in a resting state EEG, and we see, with kind of 1 out of 10 being most regulated and 10 out of 10 being least regulated. We can see, for example, for this person, a default mode network that is 10 out of 10 dysregulated. We can see a salience network that is 10 out of 10 dysregulated, a reward network that is 10 out of 10 dysregulated. So there's there's a number of the key, like, central hub in the brain that are 10 out of 10 dysregulated. So we can anticipate that this person is going to likely, we can't say for sure by looking at this, but statistically we can say this person is likely hypervigilant. They're probably don't do a very good job of uh, selecting the right cues in the environment to attend to, and then they probably don't assign those cues a very accurate um, meaning, right? So we've got a couple of problems there, as we talked about earlier, where the person that they're talking with may have like a body language expression, and that might get missed by this person. They're not seeing it, or they're seeing it because they're hypervigilant and they're assigning a meaning to it that isn't there, or amplifying that meaning. So that eye roll that was
Yeah.
barely noticeable all of a sudden is like a full dramatic eye roll to that person, right? The way
Yep.
they perceive it, right? And
Yeah.
and then, say default mode network, they're kind of, introspective self isn't there, their empathy isn't there of understanding, like, oh, I'm talking to somebody, they're stressed too, so that makes sense that they might be showing some signs. So that understanding isn't being woven into their perception. And then, reward network, it's a little challenging to tie that into this particular thing, but it is also true that we, like, a good piece of what's modifying our behavior, our possible paths, right? Our brain is always laying out, dozens or hundreds or thousands of possibilities for us. And then those, the closer and closer we get to the moment of decision or action, they constrain less and less and less until there's one that we do. And a big part of what's doing that is, what have we gotten rewarded for in the past? And so our dopamine system, if our dopamine system is dysregulated, in other words, we get internally, our brain gets rewarded for behavior that the world doesn't really reward us for, right?
Mhm.
So you can think of something like addiction, right? The
Yeah.
world doesn't really reward us for addiction, but the activity, I feel rewarded by doing the activity. And
Yeah.
that's the nature of dysregulation. So here, a person, again, they may be led down a path of how they're going to respond because of their dopamine system and what do they internally get. And so that might be like getting angry or being insulting or saying
Yep.
something mean or something of that nature that they get a little dopamine hit for, makes
Yep.
them feel good, but is not going to be helpful and constructive to the moment. But that system doesn't care about that. That's not what it functions
Yep.
on.
Yep.
Right. So we can kind of see, you know, looking at this map, we could have a pretty good guess of how this person is moving through the world relationally. Yeah.
Yep.
And then I don't know if there's anything you want to add, any nuances or your own.
Yeah, no, I'm appreciating the way you're weaving that all in. I was when you were talking about the reward network, I was thinking very much about um there are some people who just enjoy verbal sparring, right? That's just a something that for them, like debaters, that gives them that dopamine hit. And if that network is dysregulated, it might not be doing a good job of letting them kind of know where that like, okay, this is enough now, right? That sort of thing. And yeah,
Yep.
I just
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And
Yep.
or this isn't the context for
This
that,
yes. Yep.
right? Like
Yep.
couples therapy isn't
Yeah.
the place for it, or
Yep.
um,
Or
like
while you're making dinner isn't the place for it or something,
yeah,
all of that. Yeah. Yep.
all kinds of places
Yep.
where that behavior isn't context appropriate.
Yeah.
And yeah, yeah. So just to say, understanding networks
Yep.
can do a lot for people, and that's where again, doing neurotherapy can help a person see what how their brain tends to interpret the world and how it tends to present them with behavioral options. And as that person understands that they have a little bit more choice in that process. They go, oh, yep, I'm about to, nope, I know that that's my Wiley salience network and reward network getting together to have me go down a habitual path that history tells me doesn't serve me. So I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to wait for another option to come along. Right.
Yeah.
So this kind of self-understanding that comes through the neuroimaging, amazingly helpful for people.
Yeah, yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And then the added bonus is the neurotherapy can help regulate that Wiley salience network. And then,
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
yep,
Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
yep.
And then the
Oh,
next slide, if
oh,
you want to go there. So we have a couple here where we're looking at what we talked about earlier, kind of an anterior posterior cingulate dysregulation. And so this is just what it looks like on our side. Where here we can see that in this case, the person, this area, the dysregulation it's running a little slow and a little fast. So that's just a description of the dysregulation. And then if we go to the next one, we'll see similarly running a little slow, not quite as fast. But here we have an anterior posterior cingulate dysregulation, so that we know looking that this person's ongoing background continuous conversation between body, feeling, how I think about how I feel, how I regulate that, and then back into how I regulate my body. That circuit is not functioning optimally for this person, and for them in terms of what they came in with in terms of their primary complaints and what has unfolded for them across their lifetime, fit very well into this. Like they were a person who just really had a hard time being in relationship with other people, and it was always kind of contentious and fraught, and they just couldn't figure out like what's the barrier, like why can I not seem to flourish, and this was a core piece of it. So, uh, so then for them, this is where we spent a lot of time working, was regulating this circuit.
Okay. So I think the next couple of slides are just kind of looking at, I feel like I skipped one. No, I guess not. Looking at just much of what we've already talked about, I think, in terms of how dysregulation in the brain can impact an individual in their daily life, in their work life, in their relationships. And so, we look at things like decision making gets challenged. That's that frontal lobe disengagement that happens. Stress management significantly impaired, work performance, social interactions. Guy, you gave a lot of good examples about how those can be impaired. Um, and then a relationship, like communication breakdown. It's I find this area unendlessly fascinating when I have opportunity to be in the therapy room with two individuals who are in the midst of communication breakdown. It's been rare that I have had two people that where they both do the shutdown piece. Although I've had it a couple of times, and it's fascinating just to kind of look at from the outside perspective and get some sense of like, wow, this is like you can see in people that like the struggle to try and do something different, right? And it just when you see it, it's just fascinating to watch. And again, like the idea of being able to bring things like neuromodulation into the therapy room so that, if somebody's really dysregulated, let's throw an AVE on you and give you 5 minutes, and then let's try this conversation again, right? And inevitably, it goes better. Sometimes maybe it's both people with the AVEs on, which, in my ideal world, this is what will happen with anybody who's in any kind of significant relationship, is that they both people in the relationship will just have AVEs available, so that when they need them, they can toss them on and have a better round of conflict resolution that way. But just so that breakdown is it can really impair relationships. And I will say that as a therapist for probably the first, ooh, maybe third of my therapy life, um, I was completely unsuccessful in helping people who had the shutdown thing happening because I didn't know what to do with it. Basically, just had no idea what to do with that piece. And it would inevitably end up in relationships falling apart or people staying together but being miserable. And it was once Gottman's came around and taught us a little bit more, that got a little better, but it hasn't been until we really started bringing the brain in that I've been able to really kind of work differently with people, also probably with myself in regards to how I interact with people as well. Um, and then, things like heightened sensitivity, unpredictable reactions, trust issues, huge. When all of this communication breakdown, heightened sensitivity, unpredictable reactions, impulsivity, conflict escalation, when that starts to occur, trust inevitably is going to get compromised, right? And just kind of whittled away at. And that is becomes pretty significant as well. Um, Anything you want to add, Guy, before I move to the next one?
Sure. So just you're just reminding me of one of my favorite case studies, and this was a client who we were doing primarily focusing on heart rate variability, and so
Mhm.
that's what we were looking at was autonomics, and we'd done a whole training, and so I'd been watching their autonomics for about 30 minutes and doing different little stress tests, and it was perfect. It's perfect, and in some ways too perfect, but
Yeah.
amazingly perfect. Like none of the stress tests I did that normally throw people off and you get to see where are the cracks in their system. This was just like 100% all the time. Like,
Yep.
that's unusual. So I thought I would do a different, kind of a stress test. So not so much on the autonomic nervous system, but more on, you know, let's just say mind, right? To
Mhm.
give it kind of somewhat its proper location. And I just said, hey, I want you to just remember the last time that you kind of had a difficult um so a, like the last time you had a reaction, a difficult reaction to a difficult situation. So not the situation. I just want you
Yep.
to
Yep.
reflect on your response to it, right? So I wanted to stay away from anything that would be specifically, directly, explicitly triggering, and just to bring back the memory of her response. And so the moment I said, okay, like go ahead and bring something to mind, their autonomic nervous system just fell apart. So this incredibly coherent responses, sense, very attuned system, again, beyond norm, right? The normal attunement that happens in a system just completely fell apart. And it probably took 2 or 3 minutes for them to get their system back, kind of in sync with itself. But just reflecting on a memory of the dysregulation that they had from was enough to completely upset their system. And
Yeah.
and so like that, right, is part of like what you're talking about here
Yeah.
is we've been talking a lot about kind of the brain side of dysregulation, and now I'm mentioning the autonomic nervous system side, which is part of that circuit, part of that anterior posterior interoceptive circuit. But that how just something as simple as a memory
Yep.
can throw our system into chaos, and now all of a sudden we're just scrambling to keep things on track.
Yeah.
And yeah, so anyway, so what you were sharing there is just reminding me of that. It was such a the scale of the
Mhm.
change from the
Mhm.
system that spent 30 minutes just humming along, and then we bring in one difficult memory and it just falls apart. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So
Yep.
it doesn't take much
No,
to
it does
start the
not.
spiral. And that's where, again, you had mentioned AVEs in session and helping people that way. And I think that's probably what brought it to mind was AVEs have a profound effect on the autonomic nervous system.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but another thing that come to mind was having people do the heart rate variability breathing as
Yeah.
just a simple intervention. Again, in that sense of how we have learned from the science of self-regulation that saying to somebody, I want you to breathe in this particular way, like very
Mhm.
specifically like this and not
Yeah.
like these other ways, can have a profound regulating effect on the system
Mhm.
to restore the autonomics when they go out. So
Yeah.
yeah, so
Is
how
it,
these skills can just change the clinical setting. And again, it doesn't have to be in the clinic. These are things that can be done
yeah.
anywhere in any environment. AVE is maybe a little bit harder to do anywhere at any time. Um,
The
but yeah.
But the HRV breathing is, I've shared this with you before, Guy, but I work with a lot of firefighters, and that has been a tool that I like. There's not a firefighter that leaves my office that doesn't have that as a tool. And the reports I get back from them, because that's something they can do. They could be out on a call, they can be sitting on the rig, they can be at the station, and do that breathing and nobody knows they're doing it, right? It just can be as something that they engage in, and the profound effect that has on calming their nervous systems has just been like for me, I still kind of am in awe about it when I have someone come back and share something with me about that. It's just pretty incredible, and it speaks to the powerful influence of the autonomic nervous system. The other thing I was thinking about when you were talking about the memories and bring that up, and it sparked this thought in me about how oftentimes people have memories kind of working in the background that aren't really conscious to them, and then thinking about that and how that can just kind of impact them in terms of relationship as well, and those kinds of things, and really just speaks to some of the complexity of how those things can play a role. Okay, so we're kind of moving on, I think, to talking about neurotherapy, neuromodulation to work with helping people build better bonds. Probably the primary things that we will talk about, or that we tend to talk about, are the audiovisual entrainment. And I think what we can do, guys, as we go through the rest of these slides, just kind of throw in, here's where AVE would be good, or here's where neurostim would be good, that sort of thing. The heart rate variability and the neurotherapies include the neurofeedback and neurostimulation. So I'll just maybe say a couple things, and then you can add your thoughts to it, Guy. So uh, as we've looked at sort of how dysregulation can impact relationships and communication and conflict resolution and relationships. When we use neurotherapy and neuromodulation, one of the powerful things it can do is really help to boost communication skills. It can do that by improving focus. It can, and so focus meaning being able to attend to what the other person is saying in a well-regulated way, as opposed to watching and listening to what they're saying, but not really hearing because you are so wound up, and maybe, your amygdala has been hijacked. And so you're really not hearing much of what it is that you're listening to. So neurotherapy can improve that. Certainly we've talked about, audiovisual entrainment. I think that can be a wonderful tool to use, both again in therapy, but as an at-home practice that you're allowing, you're helping the brain to kind of start to be better able to kind of move into that state on its own. And that can obviously be very helpful. And we all know, on the receiving end of somebody truly attending to us, when we feel heard, we feel seen, and that's always a happy maker. And so that can be a really useful practical application for neuromodulation. Certainly any of the other things that we would do, neurofeedback, neurostim, could help with that kind of thing as well. And then just kind of being the ability to be able to articulate what it is that you are trying to share with somebody. This happens over and over. I don't know about you, Guy, but I like personally still experience this, where if I get sort of worked up about something, it can be hard to find the words to really say it the way that I'm really actually thinking about it, right? And that's just, again, part of that frontal lobe disengagement that can happen. People, sometimes that's literally like just an issue with the frontal lobe. Sometimes it's because there's mu rhythm or some mirror neuron issues, that sort of thing. But we also see it when you're in you watch two people who are in conflict, that oftentimes somebody is saying something and the other person will kind of reflect back, and then the first person says, "That's not what I meant at all. You're not getting it," and then they get angry. And the problem actually is in the articulation, right? They're not able to kind of calm themselves enough to be able to clearly articulate. And so using neurotherapies, I think like HRV, breathing is a really good strategy to be able to use for that. I think about that even like if you were even if you had like a business interaction where you had to, I don't know, give a presentation in front of a group or in front of a supervisor or something, and being able to employ that kind of a strategy right prior to doing that can help to kind of calm that autonomic system down, or balance it out. I mean, and then you're going to be better able to articulate what it is that you're wanting to share. Um, Thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I'll just try and
Yeah.
keep this short.
Yep.
So I was thinking about a couple that I work with where we decided to use a Muse headband for kind of the meditation function. And so um, one partner would tend to get a little wound up and move towards anxiety, and the other partner would tend to go into shutdown. So we were able to kind of find kind of meditation uh, programs in the Muse settings that would help bring the person who tended to go towards anxiety to give feedback to bring them down, and the person that would tend to go to shut down to keep them present. And so a couple that was really committed. I mean, they really had been doing a lot for a long period of time, and they were committed to continuing to refine their relationship and their relationship skills, and so they were willing to do this. And so what they kind of evolved somewhat on their own was they would each would put on their Muse and set their setting, and then get to a place where they were getting the feedback from the device
Mhm.
saying that they were kind of in the state that program wanted them to be in, and then they would have their conversation. And if one of them moved out of, right, so in the case they were using, the feedback sound was the birds. If one noticed the other one's birds stopped chirping, they would stop talking until their birds came back. And so I think in part of it, like, they were willing to have that kind of fun with it and have
Yep.
that kind of patience and all of it. But they genuinely found that it really worked for them. That the anxious one wasn't going off as often and as far, and in a sense ending the uh, conversation. And the one who tended to check out was staying more present. And so, in a sense, more was getting accomplished. And it was really just a remarkable experience. And so, a great application of neurotherapy
Yep.
and self regulation with neurofeedback in a relational circumstance. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think what one of the things you're highlighting too is that, like, they weren't just relying on the technology, right? They were using it to get them to those states with the understanding that then there was some work for them to do, right? And I appreciate that we remember to include that, there's still all of that relationship skill that they were engaging in, just even the process of listening and noticing, oh, your birdies have stopped chirping, I'm going to be quiet for a bit, right? That kind of thing. And that's skill based, right? So I appreciate that. So if we're looking at relationship, and the idea of kind of how stress impacts relationship. And so using neurotherapy as a way to reduce stress. Um, and I would probably say it more like, probably less likely to actually say reduce stress, but rather be able to better manage stress. And as a result, have relationship resilience. So one of the things that the Gottmans are famous for talking about is the idea that if you have a relationship where there's no conflict, there's some real trouble in that relationship. And the idea being that anytime you're in relationship, and they were talking about, coupled relationships, not you and the busboy at the restaurant or something, but anytime you're in a long-term relationship, of course, there's going to be conflict, right? What keeps that relationship resilient oftentimes is how you are working on managing stress. And so I think that, this whole idea of using neurotherapies in that regard as well. And I mean, you gave a great example with your Muse example, right? That's a nice way to be able to kind of manage that stress response. We had two different ways that that was showing up in your example, but they were able to kind of manage that using that technology, and then engage in the skills. And the idea being that the more able you are to do that, the more likely you're building that resilience within the relationship. So it's kind of an individual resilience, you being able to do that, but then as you work together, that uh, it becomes that relationship resilience.
Yeah, and I think that there's a way in which, like, there's something we could talk about that is stress reduction, but there's also something I think we could talk about that is regulating dysregulation,
Yes. Yep.
right? And thinking that you could be in a stressful situation,
Yep.
but if you can regulate yourself in the midst of it, then it's just a stressful situation.
Mhm.
But it isn't necessarily a problem.
Right.
And I mean, there's something to be said about mindfully minimizing your chance of encountering stress,
Sure.
right? Like there's something to be said for that. Um, but also this piece of just learning how to regulate the dysregulation that gives you a certain amount of resilience in the midst of the stress. And then, as you're saying here, that builds resilience in the relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yep. 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 Absolutely. And then this whole idea of empathy and connection and the role that that plays in relationship resilience and building. Um, you know, the more one is able to um, be able to put themselves in somebody else's shoes, to appreciate it, what it might feel like to be that person without taking that on. So that's not what empathy, sometimes people can get too empathic and they don't set good personal boundaries and they take other people's emotions on. Some people are wired that way a little bit and have to learn how to not do that. But that being able to just kind of express that sense of I hear you, I get where you're coming from, but not just words, but really be able to kind of feel what that might be like, can really deepen that an emotional connection. And I see this. You see this play out with friends, with really good friends, I think. But I also see it like periodically. Like I'm working with somebody in the clinic, not a client, but maybe another staff member in the clinic, and there's a particular something that is going on for that person, being able to just sort of shift and go, wow, that might, that would be that could be, could feel like this or this, it might feel uncomfortable or that might feel a little bit embarrassing, that kind of thing. Just engenders in me a certain emotional response that makes me want to soften my approach to that person, not walk on eggshells. I'm not talking about that, but just kind of to come gracefully and gently to the conversation, that sort of thing. And I think then the reciprocation of that, or the thing that comes back from that, is that idea of trust being built, right? That person felt seen and felt heard. And even if there's information being given to that person that isn't, like it's a critique of something or whatever, they still have felt seen and heard, and so that just kind of builds the trust. And like when I think about neurotherapy in this regard, the thing that I so often think of is like the network trainings, right? Like the mirror neuron network, the default mode network. If those networks are dysregulated, oftentimes this is a um, an area that of difficulty for that person is, and I see that, people that are kind of insensitive to other people's emotions, that kind of thing. Somebody who walks in a room and doesn't read it well, and maybe somebody's feeling kind of down, and the other person walks in the room and tells a joke, and when it's obvious that this is not joke time, that kind of thing. And so this area of relationship, which I feel like, I think about, like, prior to kind of the neurotherapy approach to this, there's not a lot you can do to talk somebody into having empathy. Just not. Anytime you've been around somebody who doesn't have empathy as kind of one of their like in their repertoire in some way, or doesn't have some kind of capacity for that, it doesn't matter what you do, what you say, what, Hallmark video you show them, it doesn't create it, right? And so this, to me, this area of, like, um, for relationship building is, to me, is like, this is neurotherapy. And then yes, you can teach the skills about how to say to somebody, oh my gosh, I can imagine that must feel, really difficult, or really sad, or that must make you feel lonely, or whatever it might be. Those are all the words, but empathy is actually being able to feel that, and that, on the reciprocating end of that, whether or not that is a genuine sense of empathy versus somebody just kind of saying the words. And so, yeah, I feel like I get super excited about, when I hear people talking now, when we do consults, and if somebody is telling me about empathy stuff, I get kind of excited. Like it sounds probably a little twisted that I get excited that somebody says to me, my partner told me that, I'm a jerk because I have no empathy. And I get kind of excited about that, because what I know is that there are some things we can do to help with that. And so, anyway, um, thoughts on that one, Guy?
I just think about a client of ours who probably a lot of their um, the challenges that brought them to us could be put on this one, right? Where there just wasn't there was a lack of empathy. So
Yep.
there was all kinds of behavior that was happening that
Yep.
that just didn't include other people, weren't factored in. There was just a very kind of self-centered, narcissistic
Yep.
series of behaviors that in this case, the type of the behaviors were quite destructive. And quite quickly through the process of neurotherapy, the capacity for empathy
Yep.
and came online, and we both know quite demonstrably that it was a bit of an alarming shift for that person to suddenly realize that, oh, my behavior has completely excluded all of these other people, and now I can see that.
Yeah.
And which led to another area of self work for that person to work on. But just seeing this capacity come online from almost non-existent, certainly not constraining behavior, to over a period of like 2 months coming online and constraining behavior was pretty dramatic. So yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. The capacity to bring empathy, uh, and great. And I'd say it's one of the places where I feel like neurofeedback
Yeah.
really is the tool for the job.
Yeah.
Unlike some of the other things we've talked about that are more, um, self-regulating autonomic nervous system or using neuromodulation, all great tools. But in this case, I think neurofeedback does the heavy lifting here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agree. Yep. All right. So I think we have come to the end of our journey tonight. So thank you for joining us, and uh, we will see you at the next functional forum.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you all. It was a delight. And just a reminder, I mean, Fran has our contact information up there. Just a reminder that we do a free consult. So you're always welcome to check in and just see if what we offer is right for you. We work, primarily locally, around the clinic, but we also work, um, uh, in throughout North America virtually, doing virtual consults and using devices for at-home neuromodulation. So really have options for people who are in Edina in the area for in clinic, and then anywhere really for virtual care. But a great place to start is just to start with a consult to find out if our program is a good fit for you.